Hello Internet, School Psych Gamer here.
Goodbye.
Previously, I've discussed learning disabilities and how 504 plans and IEPs may be able to help students with various needs at school. Today, I want to go a little bit more in depth into what a 504 plan is and what an IEP plan is, or an IEP. I'll also talk about what the requirements may be to get a 504 or an IEP and how you would go about requesting an evaluation if you think your student needs additional help at school. But first, let me introduce today's game. This is a game called Hades. It is made by the same team, or at least much of the same team that made a game that I played previously called Transistor. And in Transistor, you do a little bit more kind of strategic planning, and you pause it and use different abilities. In this game, it's all real time, so you don't get to pause it. You are just constantly faced with new enemies that show up, and you have to try and move around and avoid their attacks and attack them back. This game, you play as the son of Hades, who is trying to escape the underworld, and he's apparently not happy about how he's been treated by his father, and so as the game starts, and this is the very first time that I've played it, this character is trying to escape. Now, just as a heads up, this game does take place, as far as I can tell, in the underworld, and blood does play a prominent part in it, insofar as there are rivers of blood. So, if that's something that bothers you, just a heads up, blood will make an appearance in this game occasionally.
Then here goes nothing.
And at various points in the game, you receive contact from the Olympian gods, who send down these messages, and then you get to have a brief conversation with them, and then they dole out different boons or different powers that you can use in combat to help you escape the underworld and the realm of Hades. So we'll see how this game goes. I've heard a lot of great things about it. It's supposed to be pretty good. It was on sale this week, so decided to jump in. So let me go ahead and start out and kind of briefly describe what 504 plans and what IEPs are. So the name 504 plan comes from Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and is a document that is written for students that either have or are regarded as having a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So it's a very broad definition. Some people are under the mistaken understanding that a medical diagnosis is required, although it's very clear within the definition. You don't actually even have to have an impairment if you are generally regarded as having an impairment. That may be sufficient. If a student is found eligible for a 504 plan, they may receive whatever appropriate educational services or accommodations are needed to the same extent that needs are met for students without disabilities. And in practice, what this usually means is that students with a 504 plan can have access to accommodations that are necessary based on their impairment, whatever that may be. So I've been involved in 504 meetings for students with gastrointestinal issues, GI issues, where they may need to use the bathroom more regularly than others. So some of the accommodations that we've been able to provide for them is allowing for them to arrive late to class without being penalized, or allowing them to take breaks during class and provide peer or teacher support for any materials that they might have missed while they were out of class. We've also provided similar types of accommodations for students with significant anxiety that impacts their attendance, but otherwise they do quite well. And typically students with 504 plans don't receive special services like a resource class, but there's nothing that specifically prohibits those special services from being provided to students with 504s. The only exception is that IDEA funds cannot be used to support students with 504 plans, and hopefully that'll make a little bit more sense later on when we talk about those things. Now, an IEP is a different document. It stands for Individualized Education Program, which comes from IDEA, which is a law that's called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And an IEP is written for every student who's been found eligible for special education. So to qualify for special education, you must first have a disability that's defined by the federal and state governments. And second, you must need specially designed instruction and related services as a result. So students who have been evaluated and found to have a learning disability or autism or a speech language impairment or any of the other 13 defined disabilities, and as a result need or require special services, they can have an IEP written. And within the IEP, we define what the student needs are, and we specify what services will be provided to address those needs. So some examples might include special instruction to support reading, or to help with social skills or communication. And then also accommodations can be provided through the IEP. So things like extra time on tests or instructions read aloud, use of a speech-to-text program, etc. And finally, modifications to educational programs can also be provided, and those would be things like modifying homework assignments or graduation requirements, etc. By the way, if you appreciate these videos, please consider clicking on the thumbs up button to give it a like. You're always welcome to subscribe as well. So generally speaking, and from a practical standpoint, the big difference between 504 plans and IEPs are that federal funding is provided to help support students with IEPs, whereas no additional funding is provided to support students with 504s. And the result is that there are special education teachers and resources to support kids with IEPs, whereas there's typically no additional staff or resources to support kids with 504 plans. Schools are just required to provide that additional support. And that's why you often see that services for kids with 504s mostly include accommodations that don't require additional resources. I've noticed that schools often misunderstand 504s in that they think accommodations are the only things that can be provided through a 504 plan, which is just not true. But once again, since IDEA or special education funds cannot be used to support students with 504s, you couldn't just put a student with a 504 who needs reading support into a special education reading group. And I think that's probably why in every school where I've worked, and I get the sense that this is pretty common throughout the U.S. If a student needs more than basic accommodations, we're often looking at eligibility for an IEP more than just for a 504 plan. And I want to point out real quick that both of these options are formal ways of addressing needs for students with disabilities, but there are also informal ways of addressing student needs that often can get to the point much quicker. So I've been involved in many parent meetings where they're just looking for some basic help. Things like, maybe their student gets nervous when presenting to the class, so they'd like to make a video recording or just present to the teacher instead. Or maybe the teacher, or the student, has a hard time staying organized, so they often turn in assignments late because they're not really sure when they're due. So they'd like the teacher to check in with them occasionally and remind them of due dates. And often the teachers that I work with are more than willing to provide these supports for students. They want the students to do well, and making these informal accommodations is not a significant burden to them. Now, obviously I can't say that's the case for every single teacher that I've worked with. There are some that are pretty insistent that students get no more and no less than what every other student gets. But if I had to guess, I'd say probably at least 95% of the teachers that I've interacted with are totally fine providing informal accommodations, even without an IEP plan or a 504. And the nice thing is, of course, for these informal accommodations, is that no evaluations are required. Oh. Alright, so I'm down. My understanding is at this point, I go back to Hades. Yeah.
Damn it.
There we are.
I'm home.
Back at home. We'll go around and chat with a few people and then get back out there. And you know what? I think this time, kind of in, going around here and exploring and going through my bedroom and stuff like that within the game is probably not going to be as exciting as watching some of the combat. So I'm going to fast forward this a little bit. But anyway, getting back to what I was talking about, one of the benefits to just reaching out to teachers and expressing concerns or, asking for informal accommodations is that there's really typically a small lag time between when the concern is expressed and when a solution can be implemented. Because since there's no eligibility requirements, you don't have to worry about if the student will qualify or not or anything like that. You just need to reach out to the student's teacher or teachers and ask for those supports.
Greetings there, young man. Look, your Father's always been rather difficult.
So in general, providing informal accommodations and then formal accommodations through a 504 and then IEPs are often seen in like a hierarchy of increasingly intensive supports. So in many cases, schools may recommend that you try a less intensive, or in medical terms, a less invasive form of support like informal accommodations before we go to something more intensive like an IEP. And in all cases, our goal and mandate within schools is to provide a free and appropriate public education to all students with their non-disabled peers. Or in other words, in general education setting to the full extent that is possible. So if we can meet a student's needs with less changes to their education, we are always going to lean towards that rather than jumping straight to an IEP. Nevertheless, parents always have the right to request a special education evaluation to see if their student is eligible for and requires an IEP, and similarly, they have the right to request a 504 evaluation to see if their student has an impairment that substantially limits a major life activity like learning. So if you're a parent that wants to look into getting additional supports for your student, you have a number of options. First, you can always talk to your student's classroom teacher, which is what I recommend because often they can make simple adjustments so that more significant modifications aren't needed. And your student's teacher can direct you to other personnel in the school if you decide to pursue further evaluation. And each state, district, and even schools may do things differently. But in general, if you make a request for a 504 or special education evaluation to a teacher, principal, counselor, school psychologist, or other educational professional, they are required to respond within a reasonable amount of time. Technically, a verbal request is all that's required, but if you want to maintain a paper trail and in case there are any issues later on, providing a written request is never a bad idea. Now, you might ask what a reasonable amount of time is for a school to respond. It's actually not specifically defined across the board anywhere that I've been able to see. So that may also vary from state to state and district to district. But in general, I would guess that most courts or departments of education would see that within 4 to 6 weeks as being a reasonable amount of time to respond. Very often it happens much quicker than that, like within probably a week or so. But if the school determines that an evaluation is appropriate, then they should get in contact with you to get written consent to proceed. On the other hand, if they determine that an evaluation is not appropriate, then they're required to provide a written notice of why they are not going to proceed with the evaluation. Now, let's say you're not satisfied with their reasons. You can actually request what's called a due process hearing by contacting the school district, or you can also contact the State Department of Education and ask for a review of the case. Ultimately, it may be determined that the district was right to refuse to evaluate, or that they erred and an evaluation needs to be conducted. Another thing to be aware of is that if at any point in this process you're unsure on how to proceed, many states have special education or 504 advocates that you can collaborate with who are familiar with the process. And while many advocates will charge for their services, there are some that volunteer their services at no cost to parents. So check around in your state to see if there's a parent disability support network that may provide advocates free of charge. Or in some cases, you may have even local disability resource centers that will provide advocates as well. One final note, it is not necessary to have both a 504 plan and an IEP. So if a student has a disability and requires special education services, then it's implied that they could also qualify under a 504. But since everything that could be provided under a 504 can also be provided through an IEP, and a whole lot more, students who have an IEP don't need to be evaluated for a 504 plan. If you have any questions about 504 plans or IEPs, feel free to ask any questions in the comments. I'll do my best to answer them, but please remember the rules for IEPs vary from state to state, so you may need to do some additional research. I've only practiced in one state, and so my familiarity is mostly with regards to that state. So this is me, School Psych Gamer, saying 504 plans and IEPs are two formal plans that can be written to help support students in school. They each have different requirements and can provide different levels of support. See you next time.